Hello, everyone. I have had a lovely time reading your initial posts in this first module in the quote train and the visual discussion, as well as the various reading checks for the two groups of students. And what I'd like to do now, and I'll do this periodically throughout the course, is rather than giving detailed feedback on each post, I want to address some of the bigger issues that come up more in the form of like a summative comprehension checking lecture for you, okay? And I'm going to try to make it short and sweet because where I am right now, I don't have the capability to upload from my computer. And so I can't do a screen capture lecture with a PowerPoint. So all you're going to do is be looking at my face while I talk about these philosophical readings. So I'm going to try to be as concise as possible. As you all have talked about in your reading checks and in the collective meaning making and visual discussions, is that the readings this week are really asking us to think about what is the purpose of education? What should it be trying to accomplish? Now, I didn't give you any more context to that question, and many of you are bringing in really important context and particularly critical context, right? So what is the purpose of education and what kind of society? Are we talking about the purpose of education in the world we live in now or the world that we want to live in? Is the purpose of education, does it vary depending on your social or political position? Is it different in different cultural communities? These are all important questions that I want you to keep asking. What I want to do now, though, is talk a little bit about how these 6 pieces fit together and what my hope was in putting them together and trying to get you to think about. So this question of what we're educating for, in traditional philosophy, so a very Western, white, Eurocentric, democratic as in liberal democratic, right? Not liberal as in the political party, but liberal democratic as in believing in the autonomy of the individual, right, is one of the tenets of this, and that balancing the individual and the collective. So these are some of the tenets of liberal democratic theory. The United States is very much, our political system is rooted in Eurocentric liberal democratic theory. And so I want to talk about it because that is really where a lot of these readings come from or are responding to in this first week. So this question of the purpose of education, in many ways in liberal democratic theory and in traditional Eurocentric philosophy, we root this question often in the theorizing, the philosophizing of the ancient Greeks, who in their democratic experiment, which was a very imperfect experiment, right? Let us not forget that not everyone in ancient Athens participated. It was not what we would think of as a truly democratic egalitarian society. Men who were not enslaved, who had a particular kind of education, participated in the democratic decision-making of this direct democracy. But in this context, imperfect though it is, these questions of the purpose of education, the way they were wrestled with then, continue to shape our thinking today. So the ancient Greeks distinguished between, the ancient Athenians really distinguished between something that they called paideia and vocational training. So vocational training, we're familiar with that term. It means sort of an instrumental preparation for work, right? Here are the specific skills that you need to do your job. And this, in much of democratic theory from the ancient Athenians, was not as valued. It was considered baser. It was necessary, but it was not a democratic education. According to the Athenians, a democratic education occurred in paideia, which was about the edification of the soul. In many ways, it's what we think of today as liberal arts education, although not entirely. But there's much philosophical writing on the importance of teaching democratic citizens, helping them learn to live with beauty, truth, and the common good. And only then, when they have wrestled with these deeply human ideas, are they ready and able to participate in democracy. And so this distinction between paideia and vocational training is what comes up in the readings for a lot of the readings in this module. So Brighouse and Gutman are both squarely in this tradition. Gutman, like the ancient Athenians, is thinking about conscious social reproduction. The idea that we've got a good society, and through schooling, we're going to reproduce it. We're going to equip youth and ultimately adults with the skills and dispositions and knowledge to participate productively in this democratic society that we think is good. That while there are people who are excluded, the system is not fundamentally flawed. We're going to make it more inclusive, and we do that in part through this conscious social reproduction, where we are conveying beliefs such as multiculturalism. We are thinking about how do we engage in deliberative discourse across political, cultural, and identity differences. These are some of the skills and knowledge and dispositions that Gutman talks about in the interview. And I purposely gave you the interview because her book that it comes from, it's a classic, and I would certainly, if you're interested in democratic education, I would recommend it. It's hard to pull out a single chapter without leaving out fundamental pieces of her argument. So I thought the article that is really just an interview where she's talking off the cuff was a better summation or introduction. So Gutman is certainly concerned with this kind of conscious social reproduction. Brighouse includes that, but he's more getting at this idea of, okay, so how do we balance the needs and the goals of individuals in the community, right? What does it take to, for example, be a flourishing citizen in a democratic society? He talks about, right, economic capabilities, being able to contribute to your community, democratic competence, and all of these, autonomy, right? All of these, he explains how these are philosophical questions about the purpose of schooling, and that schooling should be doing all of these things at once simultaneously. And vocation is part of that in terms of economic independence, but it's not the only piece. He's not only focused on conscious social reproduction. He is looking at how the individual can benefit from schooling within our democratic society. And he also goes on to argue that how we distribute access to these educational aims is also a philosophical question, and that he uses classical liberal democratic ideas. For those of you that are philosophers or political theorists, the work of John Rawls, who we'll encounter later in the course, shapes Brighouse's thinking a lot. But it's this tension between the individual and collective that he is really wrestling with, although he doesn't write it as if he's wrestling. He writes it as if it's philosophical fact. But he is, in fact, wrestling with this tension between the individual and the collective in a liberal democratic society. Now, Crawford is also in this tradition, this classical liberal democratic tradition, but he's critiquing it. He's not critiquing that the classical liberal democratic theory or society, the Eurocentric society, is flawed in any way. But what he's saying is, hey, wait a minute, this idea, that paideia, that the edification of the soul is separate from vocational training is wrong. Right? When he talks about shop class as soulcraft, what he's asking us to consider is how vocation, how the trades, how working with our hands, these things that have been denigrated in our society in classed and raced ways, although he doesn't get into that so much, right? Those are critiques that we can bring to his writing. But he's arguing that vocation and vocational training, working with one's hands, the trades, manual labor, are all places where our soul is enriched. And that by our soul being enriched, implicit in his argument, he doesn't come at it as explicitly because he's writing for a philosophical audience, but implicit in his argument is that also equips us to be capable democratic citizens, to be the kind of citizens that Gutman wants us to produce, and that he would say deserves more of a central role in something like Brighouse's, balancing between the individual and the collective. So those three pieces are all in a very classical, traditional, liberal democratic theory. And some of you noticed that, good, right? And critiqued that, good. Because the question arises, do we want to simply consciously reproduce the society we live in? Freire takes this up. Freire says no. Right? The society we live in that we think of as liberal democratic is actually inherently dehumanizing. And he focuses on those who are explicitly oppressed in our classed system, But he also points out how those who engage in oppression, the oppressors, those in the winning end of our class system, are also dehumanized. And so in many ways, what Freire is concerned with is this idea of flourishing, which underlies all of that classical liberal democratic theory as well, that democratic citizens need flourishing lives in order to be adequate members of their society. And what Freire is pointing out is that that's not possible in a system that oppresses and that is built on oppression. Now, what we're going to see as we engage with the remaining chapters of this work, which is a classic of educational theory, if you consider yourself justice-oriented in any way, you should familiarize yourself with Freire. His principles of critical pedagogy are really foundational. There's certainly things to critique in Freire as well. But he calls on us to think about, instead of conscious social reproduction, how to engage in a dialogic pedagogy, a dialogue, a conversation, and how that dialogic pedagogy can ultimately transform the world towards justice. This is what he's going to engage us with over the remaining chapters. He also makes a point of saying that this is not something that the oppressors can do for the oppressed. This is something that the oppressed have to initiate and engage in dialogue with. So we'll dig into that more. Many of you pointed out and really clung to this idea of false generosity or paternalism in Freire's work, right? That often when we think about teaching with the oppressed, especially coming from a Catholic tradition, especially coming from a Jesuit tradition, there is an element of missionary work and of evangelizing, right? That we who are educated, we who are privileged, know what's good for you. We're going to bring education to you. That we are the ones who have access to this cultural capital that we're going to share. Someone even wrote about how this reminds them of service learning and service trips, right? That we're coming to help. And what Freire calls on us to recognize, and I'm saying us because as students at a private university, one of our identities is privileged in certain ways. We all have multiple intersectional identities, and we may not primarily identify as someone operating from a privileged economic position, but we, by virtue of being students and faculty at Marquette University, have access to cultural capital, to economic capital that put us in a privileged position. And Freire is calling on us to recognize that it is not up to us to liberate the oppressed. It is up to us to be, as other scholars will say, co-conspirators, to work in dialogue with the oppressed in order to transform the world we live in, but that the oppressed have epistemic privilege, and we'll talk about that more in later modules, but this idea that their perspective is privileged, and that the purpose of education, if what we care about is liberation, is about humanization. Now, the piece on Ignatian pedagogy, written by a former Marquette faculty and staff member, Susan Moten, really explains the Ignatian pedagogical paradigm, which many of you see a connection to Freire in the IPP in terms of its emphasis on context and reflection and engaging with gritty reality. But the question that arises is it's very much written as if it's for privileged students. And both engaging them in understanding the gritty reality that is the context of our learning, but then also as the educators who are doing for, right? Men and women for others. And Freire calls into question the possibility of that if what we care about ultimately is liberation. And we're going to see a relationship between critical pedagogy, liberation theology, Ignatian pedagogy throughout the course. And we'll be called to think about where liberal democratic theory fits in with these other philosophical orientations. And then the last piece by Dejani Shoman, I included for multiple reasons, but one of which is that this is a lay person writing about their experiences with education and where it fails to meet their own expectations for the purposes of education and what an inclusive multicultural education can look like, which is what democratic theory is concerned with. So there are things to certainly critique in here as well. Some of you talked about that it's a simplistic understanding of what education should do. But for me, it represents a layperson's engagement with philosophical ideas about the purpose of education in a democratic society. So I want to leave you with that as a summary. It's a good way to check your understanding and see how the pieces fit together. And I can't wait to see your papers on Brooklyn Dreams and your own thinking about the purpose of education.